Now, Hans and Sybil Einsick in 1963 also wanted to look at different trait theories, but they also wanted to assess a certain biological component that went into different trait theories. So, with their traits, they only had two, and they put them on a dimension, as you'll see here, kind of in this crosshair pattern. They only wanted to look at neuroticism and introversion, extroversion. Okay? And they believed that the whole array of personalities would fall somewhere in these different quadrants, right? So if someone was unstable or highly neurotic, that would be up here. And let's say they were also extremely extroverted, they would call them choleric. So they would be touchy, restless, aggressive, excitable, impulsive, active. And so you'll see the different combinations lead to different personality traits. And so they believe that there were only two dimensions you really needed in assessing people's personality, because biology also played a role in it. For example, if they were overstimulated, if their senses were overstimulated, they believe that maybe introverted people might have become that way because of previous overstimulation in youth, and so they sought to kind of keep things mellow, so to speak, as they progress older. So they were kind of looking at how those biological influencers can kind of change someone's personality. And so I thought this was just interesting to note, because this dimension wasn't in your text, but they did mention Hans Einsick, but also Sybil was also a part of developing these different dimensions of personality. So as you'll see as we go through, there are so many different traits we can look at, and that's why personality psychology is so difficult to navigate, because there's always going to be a trait that someone else says, hey, but what about this trait? There's always going to be a way to maybe condense them or expand them, because I'm sure you could think of another personality trait that's really important to you to mention. So as the research is progressing, we're trying to find systematic ways to measure these traits, but also defining which traits to use is very tricky. So that's where we kind of get with the hexaco model of traits. This is basically ocean, so our big five, plus honesty and humility. So this was a revision in 2007, just to add this dimension of saying, basically, there's also honesty and humility is important for assessing personality, because people high in this trait are sincere, fair, and modest, and people low in this trait tend to be manipulative, narcissistic, and self-centered. Again, kind of demonstrating that point that when we're going through and trying to conduct all these personality assessments, there are going to be traits that are left out, and it's a matter of deciding which traits are most pertinent for uncovering the entirety of someone's personality. It's a very tricky thing to navigate. With that being said, most of our personality assessments are self-reported measures, so that comes with a lot of limitations that I'll talk with in the future. Now, debates. Debates with the trait theories. So, what kind of issues could you see arising with the idea of a trait? Just labeling someone as having a certain trait and saying that their behaviors will follow based on this trait. Right? It kind of seems like, well, they won't always act according to that trait, will they? True, and that's what Mischel is proposing in his personality and assessment book he wrote in 1968. He's saying that, well, people may have a certain trait or may identify with a certain trait, but that doesn't mean they're going to act according to that trait in every circumstance. For example, someone who leans more towards extroversion as opposed to introversion may go out in an array of situations. Maybe they want to go to that party. Maybe they want to go have a board game night with their friends, right? But maybe they decide one night that they don't want to party. Right? What about that specific situation has led them to not act consistently with that trait? And so Mischel is just kind of being critical here and saying, like, we can't say that people are going to be consistent in every scenario. We also have to note for those differences. And so, again, we don't know the exact number and composition of traits that we're trying to use in assessing people. It's being consistently revised. And also, the situation has a lot of power over how a person's going to act, as we talked about in our last unit with social psychology, right? How the person, what place they're in, what scenario they're in, is going to affect how they're going to manifest their behavior in accordance with their trait. So maybe someone who's more introverted would not normally go out, but some kind of peer pressure encourages them to go out to a party, right? They're not acting consistently 24/7. There are going to be variations in their behavior, and they're going to be situationally based. So what Mitchell proposes is that we look at those behaviors in specific circumstances, what those specific circumstances dictate about those behaviors, and kind of, as anything else in psychology, pull general tendencies in looking at more specific personality traits and how people, for example, if we gave someone a test of honesty in order to test that personality trait, we might give them an array of situations. Well, Mitchell would say that we should test their behavior in a certain situation because that would be a better indicator of a personality trait because of the general tendencies we can pull. We can say generally they may act more honestly as opposed to consistently. And let me know if that doesn't make sense to you because I will explain it further if you have any questions. Now, this is where we stray a bit from our NOBA text to the OpenStax resource I wanted to give you because frankly it is just very interesting. So linked here on this page is the bit about Freud's theory of personality. Now, I promised early in the semester I would talk about Freud's theory of personality, and so I'm not going to renege on that. I am going to deliver. So with Freud, we talk about consciousness, right? So consciousness, what we're aware of. Unconscious, what we're not aware of. And subconscious is something over here that we're not really aware of, but can be pulled into our consciousness, right? We talked about that way back beginning of the semester. Well, with Freud, we also have the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id, Freud believed that these forces came together to dictate our personality. Note that like much other things related to Freud, this is hard to test. It is hard to support and quantify. But the id, according to Freud, is like this nasty little monster who lives in our unconscious, and it's going to have all of our darkest desires, the hedonistic pleasure-seeking center of the brain that controls the aggression and sexual urges. So the id is the, I want to do that now. That is our urge. The superego. The superego is going to be like the cultural norms that we've learned. And the societal standards we live by. So the superego says, think of that like the superhero of your brain. They know everything that's righteous and good that we should be doing. So the superego says, it is not right to do that. Well, Freud believes that our personality, or our ego, is what happens when the id and the superego have a conflict. The ego says, whoa, 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 whoa. Maybe we can compromise between what we want and what is right, quote unquote. So that's how Freud believed our personality came to be. So our urges mixed with our societal expectations and knowledge of those expectations to a compromise in how we manifested ourselves. Now with Freud, he believed that battle between the id and the superego can cause some anxiety because we're not truly getting what we want. And so that's what Freud called defense mechanisms. So defense mechanisms, according to Freud, everyone uses them. And they're a way to kind of, you don't know you're using them, but they're a way to kind of ameliorate the differences between how we feel and how we're actually presenting ourselves. It's kind of like you feel like a hypocrite, and so your brain's trying to protect yourself from the realization that you are a hypocrite. So that's Freud's defense mechanisms. And again, these relate to personality because there's a battle between what we really want and what we're presenting ourselves as. So I'll just go over a few of them. Projection. Projection is the idea of attributing unacceptable desires to others. So the example we use here says Chris often cheats on her boyfriend because she suspects he is already cheating on her. It's a way to rationalize, or I won't say rationalize because that's another one, but it's a way to engage in a behavior or their unacceptable desires by believing everyone else is doing it. Another type of defense mechanism, sublimation. I'll do that one. Sublimation is redirecting unacceptable desires through socially acceptable channels. So an example, Jerome's desire for revenge on the drunk driver who killed his son, right? Because that's largely unacceptable by what we know of the superego. Revenge, right? Is channeled into a community support group for people who have lost loved ones to drunk driving. So he's taking that unacceptable energy and putting it into something that's socially acceptable, trying to ameliorate the difference between the superego and the id to what is presented through his personality and the actions that he does. Another example, Mike Tyson, famous boxer. He was a kid who used to beat up other kids, right? And he was huge. And so someone saw him one day and said, hey, let's get this kid in boxing, right? Because violence in and of itself is not socially acceptable. But violence in a boxing arena is socially acceptable. Maybe one more just to hammer the point home. Sorry, I was trying to find one that's a little more interesting because a lot of these are self-explanatory. Displacement. There we go. Transferring inappropriate urges or behaviors onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. So this example is anytime your parent has come home pissed off from work and seemed to snap at you, or anything, pardon my language, or anything like that situation. This is an example of displacement. Why? Because the inappropriate urges they had, maybe they got chewed out by their boss. That inappropriate urge to yell back at their boss, they can't do. It's threatening. They could lose their job. They could lose their income. And so they may displace those emotions on a less threatening target, such as their partner or spouse, or their children. That's an example of displacement. Anyway, Freud's defense mechanisms. Fun stuff. If you want more resources, let me know. Just, I got a couple minutes and I'm trying to condense it. Erik Erikson. You will talk a lot about this in developmental psychology if you have to take it. But basically, we have different developmental tasks as we progress through life. And with those developmental tasks, successful completion will help form a well-rounded, stable personality. So for example, I'll talk about adolescence because, identity crises in adolescence is so is a hot topic of conversation. But for example, Erikson says that in our teenage years, we have the task of figuring out our identities or being stuck in a perpetual state of confusion about who we are. So these different developmental tasks all build to this presentation of who we are as a person. And Erik Erikson was a neo-Freudian. So what does that mean? Freud and Erikson both uncovered childhood experiences and unconscious desires and how they affected the manifestations of our behaviors and our personality and our thoughts. But Erikson focused more on the psychosocial aspect of things, where Freud heavily emphasized the sexual aspect. So, you won't need to know this for the exam, but I just wanted to touch on it in case you're interested. And in conclusion, a lot of these assessments we're looking at, we're like, well, how do we test someone's personality? Well, oftentimes we use self-report inventories. We have people tell us what they think about themselves. You answer questions like, I enjoy staying home, and then they rate the statement based on how much they agree or disagree with that. And while that's great for getting some information, it also has its limitations, right? Sometimes people say what they think they want us, what we think they want them to say. Sometimes people don't want to tell the truth because they're scared of being judged for some reason. But on the whole, it's a good way to get kind of an idea of what people think of themselves, even if implicitly it doesn't match. We also have projective tests. These aren't used as often, and they're not as reliable as other methods. But you have Rorschach's ink blot test. You may have seen this. This is used in popular media a lot, where people make the joke like, what do you see in this image? And it's something looking like this image on the far right. Yeah, so apparently with these types of projective tests, also thematic apperception test, that's in those types of tests, they give people ambiguous pictures like the one you've seen here and have the people write a story about that picture. And they believe that these projective tests, people are going to project, kind of like a projector, project their personality into the story and into the image that they see. Again, not very reliable and not used that often. But in conclusion, traits versus situations. Traits are going to be consistent over time, and it's great for predicting some aspects of behavior or how people will behave. But the situation also has a heavy power in indicating how people will act. Okay, so a normally honest person may not cheat on a test, but if admission into their top tier college is on the line, could that situation have an influence over them, right? So not saying traits have all the power in the situation or the situation has all the power, but those two things are going to come together, and trying to delineate their effects to determine which parts of personality are going to be emphasized it's a tough task. And so people are going to differ in these different traits. And there's so many different traits to measure. How do we most effectively measure these different traits? And that's what we're consistently trying to do. And as a science, that's what we should be aiming to do, is consistently revise and examine our method to make it more systematic in order to have reliable data and reliable tests in which to test people. Anyway, that's all I have for this week. So let me know if you have any questions. I will be happy to answer them, or we can do FaceTime, Zoom, whatever you got, or you can just send me an email. I hope you all enjoy your week.